Montana Territory. 1884, the wind tore across the open plain as the jailhouse door slammed shut behind her, and Josephine Granger did not flinch. She stood tall, chin lifted, boots kicking up dust as she walked past the gawking townsfolk of Three Pines. The sun peeled heat off the wooden boardwalks, but it was not the sun that stung, it was the words trailing behind her. "You're no lady," hissed a voice from the crowd. "Not after what you done." Josephine kept walking. Her dress was torn at the hem, collar bloodied, not hers. The man she stabbed in self-defense had lived, but the law had not cared much for details. Sheriff gave her 2 nights in the jail and a warning that next time she might not walk out. She passed the general store, where the baker's wife clutched her child tighter. At the saloon, men leaned on the porch rail, whispering too loudly. "She used to be decent," said one. "Before she ran off with that outlaw. Before she left her children," said another. Josephine stopped short. Her jaw tightened. She had not left her children. She had hidden them from the man who beat her and from the law that turned its back on women like her. The price of protecting them had been everything. Her name, her home, her place in this town, but she had done it, and she would do it again. "Josie," she turned. A boy, no, not a boy anymore. A man on horseback, dusty brown hat pulled low, eyes like wet earth, and a voice she had not heard in 9 years. "Ransom Tate," she whispered. He was off the horse before she could blink, large hands catching her shoulders like he was afraid she might vanish. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. You were in jail." "I said it's nothing." He searched her face and something in his gaze softened. "You still got that look, like you're about to run." Josephine stepped back. "You should not be here. I came for you." She stared hard at him. "You should not have." "I heard what happened. About the man. About you being locked up while everyone else just watched. You came all this way for that." "I came because I never stopped looking for you." Josephine blinked against the sun. "That was a long time ago." "Not to me." He tilted his head, watching her like he was waiting for her to fall apart. She would not. She had done too much, survived too much. "I got someone with me," she said, his brow furrowed. She turned and whistled once. From behind the livery stable, a girl appeared, no more than 8, dragging a smaller boy by the hand. The little one hid behind his sister's skirts, staring at Ransom with wide, wary eyes. "My children," Josephine said plainly. "Olive and Oscar." Ransom looked from the girl to the boy and then back to Josephine. She braced herself. "You're no lady," someone muttered again from the crowd. Ransom turned slowly, his voice low but strong. "She's still my bride." The words fell like thunder. Josephine blinked. "You cannot say that." "I just did. You do not even know them." He crouched in front of Olive, offered a hand. "Nice to meet you, I'm Ransom." She did not take his hand, but she looked him in the eye. "Mama said no one can know our names." "That is a smart rule," Ransom said. "Your mama's a smart woman." Oscar peeked out. Ransom smiled at him. "You like horses?" Oscar nodded once. "Well," Ransom said, standing again, "there's a big one tied out front. His name's Birch. You want to help me brush him down?" Oscar looked to Josephine. She gave a quiet nod. With a little nudge from Olive, Oscar ran to Ransom's side and the two disappeared around the corner. Josephine turned her face away and wiped quickly at her eyes. "You need a place to go," came a voice behind her. She turned. It was the preacher's wife, eyes wary but kind. "You can stay in the old rectory behind the chapel," the woman said. "No one uses it. I won't tell the others." Josephine hesitated. "Thank you." The woman nodded once, then slipped back into the crowd. That night, she sat in the rectory's back room, children asleep beside her on a straw mattress, a candle flickering low. She watched the flame and tried not to remember the last time she had sat like this with a man who had promised her safety and gave her bruises instead. A knock came at the door. She opened it to find Ransom standing there, holding a sack of food and a blanket draped over one arm. "I do not need anything," she said. "I know, but you have been through hell. Let me be decent." She stepped back, letting him in. He set the food on the table and folded the blanket over the back of a chair. "You should not have said what you did," she said. "About me being your bride. I meant it. We were children. And I loved you then, just like I love you now." Josephine looked away. "I cannot afford love. You do not have to buy it. It is already yours." Her hands trembled and she clenched them into fists. "You do not know what I've done. I know what they say, but I also know what you did for those children. That tells me everything I need." She looked up at him then, eyes red and tired. "I do not know how to be anything anymore. You do not have to be anything but yourself." Ransom stepped closer, slow, careful. He reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You're not alone anymore, Josie." The candle flickered. She reached out and touched his wrist, fingers curling there like she was afraid he might pull away. He did not. Outside, the prairie wind howled low and lonesome. But in that little room there was warmth. There was the soft sound of breathing children. There was the start of something that had never quite died. Josephine looked up into his face, and for the first time in years, her voice did not shake. "Stay." Rain came during the night, soft and steady against the roof of the rectory. Josephine woke to the sound, blinking into the dark, the warmth of the wool blanket still clinging to her shoulders. Ransom had taken the floor near the hearth, boots off, hat tipped low over his eyes, though she knew he wasn't sleeping. His breath was too even, too quiet. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the children. Olive had curled against her side, one small hand still clenched in sleep. Oscar had drifted closer to the wall, thumb tucked near his mouth. Josephine rose, barefoot, and crossed to the stove in the corner. She lit the lantern with practiced fingers and poured water into the kettle. "You always did keep watch," she said without looking at him. Ransom pushed his hat back. "You always drifted off without saying good night." She didn't answer, only set the kettle over the coals. "Do they know about their father?" His voice was low, not pressing. She leaned against the counter. "They know he's dangerous, that's enough. I heard he's looking." Josephine turned, the lantern catching the sharp line of her jaw. "You saw him?" "No. But I passed a man near Miles City who asked too many questions. Said he was chasing a runaway woman with 2 children. Claimed she was his wife. Said she stole from him." She crossed her arms. "He meant me. I figured." The kettle began to hiss. "I have to keep moving," she said, quieter now. "I can't settle in one place too long. That's how he finds us." "You won't have to keep running," Ransom said. "Not if you come with me." She looked down at her hands. "And go where? You barely know the shape of my life now. I know enough, and I've got land. South of the Yellowstone, near the Absaroka foothills. I built a cabin last winter, got 2 mules and enough seed to start spring planting. There's room." Josephine gave a faint shake of her head. "You make it sound simple. It's not, but it's honest. And it's far from here." She pulled the kettle off the fire and poured the water into 2 tin cups. "They need schooling. There's a schoolhouse in Gardner, a month's ride from my place, but I can ask around. Might be a teacher who comes through." She handed him a cup. "They've never had a proper bed, not once. Then we'll build them one." Josephine sat across from him, cupping her hands around the heat. "You talk like I'm still the girl you used to know. I talk like I never stopped hoping you'd come back to yourself." She studied him. The years had carved his face deeper, but his eyes held steady. He wasn't a man who said more than he meant. "You keep saying we," she said. He nodded once. "Because I didn't come looking to pass through." The lantern guttered slightly, casting a long shadow across the floor. "I don't trust easy anymore," she said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking you not to shut the door before you've seen what's outside it." Josephine looked over her shoulder at the children, both still sleeping. They don't know what it's like to stay in one place. They expect to be woken in the dark and told to run. Then let's give them something else to expect. She stood, crossed to the bed, and pulled the quilt higher over Olive's shoulder. The girl stirred but didn't wake. "You'll need help with the land." "It's too much for one man." "I figured that." Josephine turned back to him. "I know a little about planting. I worked a homestead once before everything went wrong. You'd remember fast." She nodded slowly, then walked to the door and opened it. Rain still fell, but lighter now, misting the earth. "I'll decide in the morning," she said. Ransom stood and joined her, looking out into the gray light. "I'll be here," he said. She didn't answer, but she didn't close the door on him either. And when she curled back beneath the quilt, she left room beside her for hope. Just enough. At first light, the rain had passed. The sky stretched pale and quiet over 3 pines, the streets still damp, the air holding the clean scent of wet dust and pine. Josephine laced her boots by the hearth while Olive helped Oscar button his coat. Ransom waited outside, saddling Birch with a second blanket tied behind the saddle horn. Josephine stepped out with her coat draped over one arm, eyes scanning the empty street. "You said a cabin," he nodded. 3 days riding if we keep steady. There's a river crossing, but not a deep one. You'll need to ride with me the first stretch. Trail's too narrow for a wagon." "I figured as much," she said, then turned to the children. "You remember what I told you?" Olive nodded. "No names. No talk to strangers." Josephine knelt and fastened Oscar's scarf. "You stay close. No wandering, no matter what." Oscar looked up at her, solemn. "I won't." Ransom took a step forward. "I've got 2 pack mules waiting north of town. We'll meet them by sundown." Josephine rose. "We'll ride till dusk. No longer." He lifted Olive up behind the saddle, then turned to Josephine. She hesitated a second longer before swinging up behind him, her hand steady on his shoulder. They rode out without fanfare. No one stopped them. No one waved. The town gave no farewell. By midday, they reached the edge of a cottonwood grove, the trail narrowing between creek and bluff. The horses picked their way along the muddy bank, hooves careful on the loosened soil. Ransom kept his voice low. "You ever been that far north?" "Not since I was 17. She adjusted Olive's grip around her waist. "There was a doctor in Livingston who took me in once. Let me clean his office in exchange for medicine." "You were sick?" "No," she said, "but Oscar was born early. I didn't have coin for a midwife. He let me sleep in the back room till the bleeding stopped." Ransom didn't speak for a while. Then, "I always wondered what happened after you left Red Lodge." "I took the railroad west as far as I could, then walked. We stayed in a church basement for a winter. There was a woman there, Reverend's sister. She taught Olive her letters." He glanced back at Olive. "That's so," the girl nodded against her mother's back. "I can read most words. Mama teaches me from newspapers." Josephine shifted in the saddle. "It's not much. But it's something. It's more than most." They crossed the creek at a shallow bend. The water came up to the horses' knees, cold and fast, but Birch moved steady, and Oscar clung tight to Ransom's belt behind them. On the far bank, the trail widened again. They made camp beneath a stand of firs, the ground damp but sheltered. Ransom built the fire while Josephine unpacked dried beans and a heel of cornbread she'd wrapped in oilcloth. The children huddled close, boots steaming near the flames. After they ate, Ransom set about checking the horses' hooves while Josephine rinsed their tin plates in the creek. When she returned, she found Olive curled beside the fire, eyes heavy, and Oscar nestled against his sister with a blanket tucked beneath his chin. Josephine stood across from Ransom in the firelight, her arms folded. "You're quiet tonight." "I'm thinking." "About?" He looked up. What it'll be like, having you there, all of you." She lowered herself onto a flat stone. "You sure you want that? I wouldn't have come otherwise." She stretched her hands toward the fire. "They'll need clothes, proper ones, and shoes that don't split after a week. I've got a neighbor widow named Thompson. She sews for trade. I can take her a sack of flour." Josephine watched him for a long moment. "You've thought of all this." "I've had time." She pulled her coat tighter. "I don't know how to be someone's wife anymore." He didn't smile. "I don't need you to be anything but yourself." "I never did." The logs cracked, sending up a coil of sparks. Josephine reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. She handed it to him. He opened it carefully. Inside was a charcoal sketch, rough but careful. A woman with a braid over her shoulder, 2 children at her feet. "I make one every winter," she said, "so I don't forget what we looked like in case I ever lost them." Ransom folded the paper and held it close. "You won't lose them." She watched him tuck it into his coat. "I stopped believing in promises." "That's fair," he said. "But I'll still make mine." She leaned back, letting the fire warm her face. "You're a fool, maybe," she paused, "but you're a steady fool." He let out a breath. "That the best I'll get, for now," he nodded, satisfied. She glanced over at the children, sleeping easy for once. Then back at Ransom, who was watching the fire but not lost in it. "I'll come with you," she said quietly. "We'll stay." He didn't speak, just reached over and touched her fingers where they rested on her knee. His hand was warm, calloused, certain. Josephine didn't pull away. Not this time. The wind moved through the trees above them, soft as breath. And for the first time in years, she let the quiet settle without needing to brace against it. By the 3rd day, the land began to change. Pines gave way to open hills, the air drier, colder. Snow lingered in the shadowed gullies, crusted and gray, and the sky pressed low like a warning. Josephine rode beside Ransom now. Oscar curled up against her chest in a sling she'd stitched from her shawl the night before. Olive rode ahead on the mule, reins looped in her small hands, chin lifted like she belonged to the land already. Ransom pointed toward a ridge in the distance. "Cabins just beyond that rise. Creek runs behind it. Wood piles likely buried, but I've got enough dry split inside to warm us till spring." Josephine didn't answer right away. Her gaze followed the line of snow along the hill's edge, the way the scrub turned silver in the wind. "You built it yourself." "Started it last March. Took near 6 months. I figured if I waited for company, I'd be waiting forever." She adjusted Oscar's weight against her. "You always were stubborn. And you always knew how to make a man feel seen." Atop the rise, the roof came into view, a steep pitch of weathered boards, smoke already curling thin from the stone chimney. The door and shutters were closed, but the fence around the small corral stood straight, and a single oil lamp burned behind the window pane. Josephine slowed her mount. "You left the lamp burning." "I left a boy behind to tend things. My sister's son. He's 15, quiet. Good with animals. I hope he doesn't mind the rest of us. He'll do what's asked." The mule picked its way down the slope, Olive guiding it with slow, careful nudges. Ransom dismounted near the gate and reached up to help Josephine down, hands steady beneath her waist. She let them linger a breath longer than needed. Inside, the warmth hit first. The cabin held heat like a held breath. Thick logs sealed tight with clay and straw, a heavy stove ticking in the corner. The boy, lanky and dark-eyed, nodded once at Josephine, then ducked into the loft without a word. Ransom set his rifle on the wall hooks. "Namesily, I told him to give you room." Josephine unwrapped Oscar and settled him on a folded quilt near the stove. "He's polite. You hungry? We ate before the last ridge." Ransom filled the kettle from a barrel in the corner, set it on the stove. "You want to see the land?" She looked down at her boots, heavy with dried mud. I think I'd rather sit a while. I'll take Olive to see the barn, show her the chickens. Josephine nodded, and Olive followed him out the door, scarf wrapped tight under her chin. Left alone, Josephine walked the length of the room. A shelf held a few books, James Fenimore Cooper, a psalter, a worn volume of sermons. Beside them, a wooden comb and a box of matches. The bed in the corner was wide enough for two, the quilt stitched in strong, simple squares of indigo and rust. Oscar stirred, and she knelt beside him, brushing his hair back. "We won't leave again unless we have to," she whispered. "I promise." He didn't answer, but his breathing deepened, and she stayed there, one hand resting over his ribs until the door creaked open. Ransom stepped back in, cheeks ruddy from the wind. She found the henhouse. "Got a fresh egg in her pocket and a dozen questions I couldn't answer." Josephine stood. "She needs that. I know." They stood across from one another, nothing in the room but the sound of the kettle and the wind moving faintly through the chinks in the wall. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I've got a neighbor half-day's ride east. He's a circuit judge. Comes through every 3 weeks, I figured. If you and me are going to raise these children together, it ought to mean something, out loud." Her eyes didn't waver. "You mean to marry me?" "I do." She walked past him to the stove, poured 2 tin cups of hot water and handed him one. "I'm not what I was," she said finally. "I know." She sipped, then sat on the edge of the bed, watching the steam rise. "You want to say vows in front of a man with a book, I'll stand beside you, but I need time to find my feet. I've been running too long to stop all at once." Ransom didn't press. He sat beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "I'll wait, long as you need." She didn't smile, but her voice softened. "I won't make you wait long." Outside, the wind had settled. Inside, the quiet was no longer something to brace against. It was something they could build within. Josephine set her cup down, looked at his hands resting on his knees. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll teach Olive to sew a hem." Ransom nodded. "And I'll show Oscar how to hold a hammer." Their eyes met in the hush. "Then we'll be settled," she said. "We already are," he answered, and she didn't turn away. The judge arrived beneath a pale sky with frost still clinging to the grass. He rode a dun-colored mare and wore a wool coat patched at the elbows. Ransom led him in through the gate, quiet and nodding, while Josephine stood outside the cabin brushing crumbs from Oscar's collar. She had mended her only good dress, the navy one with the stiff cuffs and missing button, and she'd braided her hair with a strip of muslin Olive had dyed with boiled walnut husks. It wasn't fine, but it was clean, and it was hers. The judge tipped his hat. "You the woman marrying Ransom Tate?" Josephine met his eyes. "I am." He glanced at the children, then to the cabin behind them. "No guests," she shook her head. "We've had enough eyes on us." He patted his coat pocket. "Got a Bible and a page to sign, that'll do." Inside, the fire burned low. Olive sat straight-backed on her stool, hands folded. Ellie stood in the corner, jaw tight, as though unsure if he should be part of the moment or not. Ransom took his place by Josephine's side, his coat brushed clean, his boots newly oiled. The judge opened the Bible and read the words slowly, his voice rough from the ride. When he asked the questions, Josephine answered without pause. When it came Ransom's turn, he didn't look at the judge at all, he looked at her. "I do," he said, not loud but sure, and that was enough. The judge had them sign the page beneath the lamp. Josephine's handwriting trembled slightly, but the name came easy. Josephine Tate. After he left, she stood by the window, watching the mare disappear over the ridge. Ransom came up beside her. "You all right? It doesn't feel real yet." "It is." She turned toward him. "I didn't think I'd ever have a name again, not like this. You've got one now. And it's yours to keep." Later that day, Ransom walked the edge of the fields with Olive, marking where the first seeds would go once the frost broke. Josephine stayed behind, teaching Oscar how to grind corn with the small hand mill kept under the shelf. His hands were too small to manage it alone, but he laughed when she helped him push the handle around. That evening she found Ransom in the barn, oiling the harness straps. He looked up when she stepped in. "You said something back in town," she said. "That you never stopped looking." He set the rag down. "I meant it. I believe you. I didn't then, but I do now." He stood brushing dust from his sleeves. "I never said what it meant to see you again," she continued. "To have someone see me and not just the mess behind me. You were never a mess to me." She took a step forward. "You were the only good I had for a long time. You deserve to know that." He reached out and touched her cheek gently, his thumb tracing just above the line of her jaw. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Josie, and I've known a few." She leaned into his hand. "I want to build more than survival. I want to build something that lasts. We already started." She kissed him then, slow and certain, the barn quiet around them but for the soft rustle of hay and the creak of the wind outside. In the days that followed, the snow melted in patches, revealing the stubborn green beneath. Josephine helped Ransom clear the rocky stretch near the creek, where they agreed to plant beans and squash. Olive took to the garden rows like she'd been born to them, and Oscar followed Illy with blind trust, watching the older boy feed the chickens and carry wood. Ransom built a cradle from pine planks for Oscar just to hold his dolls, he said with a wink, and Josephine stitched a new hem on Olive's dress from the scrap of her wedding braid. One night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch, wrapped in a single blanket, watching the last of the smoke rise from the chimney. Josephine leaned her head on Ransom's shoulder. "I think we're going to be all right," she said. "We already are." They didn't speak more than that. They didn't need to. The land softened in the weeks that followed. The river ran louder, the birds returned, and the soil gave easily beneath their hands. The cabin filled with small, quiet sounds, Olive reading aloud, Oscar humming as he stacked kindling, Illy whistling low while he carved a new yoke pin. And Josephine, who had once measured her life in escape routes and sleepless nights, found herself rising each morning with a purpose other than fear. She mended, planted, cooked, and kissed her husband beneath the eaves. She taught her daughter to thread a needle and her son to tell north from south by the moss on the trees. They never spoke of the man who had hurt her. He never came. And if he ever did, Ransom kept a rifle oiled and ready, but it stayed above the door untouched. By midsummer, the beans climbed high and the squash blossoms opened wide. Olive had a friend 2 ridges over, a girl her age who traded letters by hand. Oscar had a new colt to follow, and Illy had grown into the role of older brother without ever being asked, and Josephine had a home. A name. A man who saw her as she was and chose her still. One evening she stood in the doorway, watching the sun dip behind the hills, the light washing the cabin in gold. Ransom came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Tell me what you see," he said. She leaned back against him. "I see everything I thought I'd lost. And now, I see what I've built in its place." They stood like that until the light faded, until the stars blinked into view and the night settled around them like a promise kept. And in that quiet, held fast by the man who'd waited for her without question, Josephine knew the running was done. She had found not just shelter but belonging, not just safety but love, a life that would hold, a life that would last.